Welcome, good morning everyone, and welcome to this first in a series of three lectures on states of the Filipino novel. No? So this lecture is on José Rizal and the Philippine National Epic, and this lecture is co-hosted by the Literary and Cultural Studies program of the Ateneo de Manila University and Exploding Galaxies in partnership with Kritika Kultura and PLUME. To formally welcome us to this event, we have the Dean of the School of Humanities, Dr. Patricia Lambino, to give the opening remarks. Dean Trish.
Okay, on behalf of the School of Humanities, I welcome all of you students here to our humble conference room. I would like to welcome especially Miss Nicole CuUnjieng Aboitiz, who left her lovely Siargao to be with you and talk about Rizal and the national epic. Thank you very much, Dr. Charlie Veric, for preparing this. I mean, I know that it's your new program that's spearheading all of this. And in case anyone here from Exploding Galaxies is around, a warm welcome to you also. This is your second time here. I hope you're not cringing by my calling you, and I'm talking to Exploding Galaxies, an industry partner. These days, I am asked to list down who are the potential employers of these students, who are the, literary outfits, etc., that will hire not just your graduates, but will need the help of your faculty experts, etc., etc., etc. And so, I thought, can I unironically name them as an industry partner, knowing that they might find it, offensive. They might find it strange. I would like to think that we here are doing more than just producing inputs to the industry, right? Rather, we are here to explore art, humanities, and here to build a community that I think our novels also build. And so, congratulations again to the LCSP for enlarging their community. Take a look at their little new office there. From there, I think there will be a whole new flurry of activity. I'm very excited to see what they have in store for us for the rest of the year. So, thank you again and welcome to everyone.
Thank you very much, Dean Trish. Allow me to introduce our speakers today. We are really grateful to have Dr. Nicole CuUnjieng Aboitiz, who is a visiting scholar at Columbia University's Weatherhead East Asian Institute, a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, an institute fellow at the University of St. Andrews Institute for Transnational and Spatial History, editor for Global History and Theory at the journal History Compass, and a Board of Trustees member of the Toynbee Prize Foundation. She was also a research fellow at the University of Cambridge for 6 years, where she supervised in world history. Her broad research interests center on Southeast Asian and global intellectual history. Her current research analyzes the co-constitution of class and relationships with the natural environment over the 19th to the 20th centuries in the Philippines. She earned her PhD with distinction in Southeast Asian and International History at Yale University. Her first book, Asian Place, Filipino Nation, A Global Intellectual History of the Philippine Revolution, 1887 to 1912, published by Columbia University Press in June 2020, charts the emplotment of place in the proto-national thought and revolutionary organizing of turn of the 20th century Filipino thinkers. Outside her academic work, she is a board member of Local Lab in Siargao, an island sustainability NGO in the Philippines. She also wrote a monthly opinion column for the Manila Times from 2013 to 2016. She worked for the Office of the Chief Economist and served at at the Philippines Department of Finance from 2016 to 2017, shepherding the economic development cluster's priority reforms, and co-founded Pampublico, a political discussion lab that seeks to reorient mainstream Philippine discourse away from personality politics towards substantive policy discussions. We also have Dr. Charlie Samuya Veric, who is a self-taught poet, independent curator, and intellectual historian. He is the author of the best-selling and self-acclaimed poetry collections Histories 2015 and Boyhood, a Long Lyric 2017, both from the Ateneo University Press. His third book of poetry from the University of the Philippines Press, The Love of a Certain Age 2019, explores intergenerational intimacy in the age of online dating applications. A companion piece to his intellectual history of Filipino decolonization, and his fourth book of poetry from the University of the Philippines Press, No Country 2021, records his observations of South African society after the apartheid. Songs from Manunggul, his fifth poetry book published by the Ateneo University Press in 2024, describes the global Filipino diaspora through the lives of four characters from a mythic hometown. In spring 2025, he will be an artist in residence at the Wedding Cake House in Providence, Rhode Island, along with Grace Talusan. His more scholarly essays have appeared in American Quarterly, Common Knowledge, Current Writing, Misferica, Kritika Kultura, Kyoto Review of Southeast Asia, Perspectives in Arts and Humanities Asia, Philippine Studies, Rethinking History, Social Text, and Thesis 11, among others. His book from Ateneo de Manila University Press, titled Children of the Post-Colony 2020, examines the emergence of a post-colonial history of ideas after the Philippines gained its independence from the United States in 1946. He is currently working on a new book project titled Forging the Post-Colony, Cultural Cold War in Filipino Decolonization, which builds on the arguments of children of the post-colony and reconstructs the foundations of post-colonial area studies. He has a PhD in American Studies from Yale University, where he was awarded the John Hay Whitney Fellowship. He was a fellow of the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study in 2018 and of the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Study in 2023. The inaugural fellow of the Ricardo Leong Institute for Global and Area Studies for Philippine Studies and the Leo A. Cullum S.J. Professorial Chair in the Humanities. He is an associate professor and founding director of the Literary and Cultural Studies program of the Ateneo de Manila University. Friends, let us give a big hand to Dr. CuUnjieng Aboitiz and Dr. Veric.
Thank you for that. Right. This talk on Philippine national epics will cover the production and circulation of the Noli under four flags: Spanish, American, Japanese, and Filipino, and will provide a meta-criticism of its various interpretations over time. In particular, this talk will explain the key place that the Noli occupies in theorizing nationalism, showing the capacious quality of the novel to accommodate visions of national belonging, as well as its exceptional capacity to contain contradictory interpretations. In surveying 100 years of Rizal in the philosophy of Filipino nationalism, we will show his production and circulation as a key historical figure for imagining the Philippine epic of nationalism, with a contrast, albeit brief, to Francisco Baltasar's Florante ad Laura, amounting to the triumph of the novel over poetry in narrativizing nationalism. We will interrogate the two national epics by analyzing their respective aesthetics and politics of love as they relate to theorizations of the nation state, the affect of nationalism, and the process of nationalizing writ large. The courtly love of the 1838 Florante features claims to patria via critiques of injustice. This stands in contrast to the Noli's more developed theory of effective patriotism and of the nation state related with and through various forms of love. This progression of the affective national theorization of these two epics from courtly love, representing political injustice, to outright affective patriotism and political nationalism also tracks the contemporaneous development of the Creole Manila rebellions of the self-styled Hijos del País in 1823 into the truly national Philippine Revolution of 1896 to follow, in addition to eventually the politics of post-colonial discourse on the subjective experience of colonization and nationhood. Through these lines of inquiry, this talk will explore the contradictions and forms of national epic making in the Philippines, explaining the pride of place that the novel occupies in post-colonial theory and the Philippine national theorizing, precisely because the genre is founded on the subjective and the phenomenal as experienced in the everyday. In particular, we will mine what critics have considered to be Noli's pride of place in the Filipino experience of nationalism, alongside the paradox of bachelorhood that defined the novel's protagonist, who remains a single man. The contradiction that shapes the novel, its great power to reproduce the affect of nationalism and the logic of irreproducibility of that bachelorhood conveys, will be related to the post-colonial politics of newness, shaping the anti-colonial project of Rizal's fiction, a promise that begins with the newness of the historical novel as a global form in the context of the equal newness of anti-colonialism as a world historical event. Next slide. Forgive my terrible PowerPoint. So on one level, Florante and Laura and the Noli are both love stories, featuring a suffering male protagonist lover and a beautiful female beloved whose love is thwarted by powerful plot forces. They're also both fashioned after Spanish literary traditions, the former of courtly love and the latter of romanticism. Set in a dark forest, Florante and Laura recounts the love between the titular protagonists from the perspective of the hero. Hailing from the Christian kingdom of Albania, Florante is tied to a tree, narrating his tragedy, particularly the death of his father and the impending marriage of Laura to his archenemy, Count Adolfo. A passing Moor named Aladdin overhears Florente's lament, signaling the beginning of their friendship and the foreshadowing of the lovers' final reunions. Florente and Laura on the one hand, Aladdin and Flerida on the other. Aladdin nurses Florente back to health, the former preparing the return of the latter to reclaim his kingdom, marry his sweetheart, and maintain perpetual peace between Moors and Christians. Meanwhile, the Noli opens as the protagonist, Crisostomo Ibarra, returns to his homeland from his 7-year exodus following his father's death. His father's corpse, he learns later, is gone, exhumed from the Catholic cemetery and thrown into a raging river. In a fit of anger, Ibarra confronts Padre Salvi, from whom he confirms that the real culprit is Padre Damaso. He eventually hits Damaso on the head and thus begins Ibarra's quest for reform in the colony. Framing the friars as embodiments of moral corruption and decay, Ibarra plans to build a school, his love affair with Maria Clara suffering in return, as he becomes a threat to the colonial social order. Analyzing the opening paragraphs of the Noli in Imagined Communities, the political thinker Benedict Anderson drew on the intimacies of Rizal's authorial gaze, which describes a community of unmet strangers who nevertheless hear of and anticipate a particular dinner party on a particular street on a particular day of October. This specific, yet imagined community extends diachronically to the reader, whom the narrator of the Noli addresses directly and enfolds into its imagined circle of assumed or possible intimate knowledge and belonging. Anderson then directly contrasted this national consciousness in the making with the consciousness of the most celebrated previous literary work by an Indio, Baltasar's story of Florante and Laura in the Kingdom of Albania, the setting of which, a fabulous medieval Albania, is utterly removed in time and space and intimacy from any possible shared Filipino community. Yet Anderson's theorization of imagined community neglected bonds of religion, which do feature in Florente and do thread the audience to the protagonist and to the story of Christian conversion. The religious conversion narrative allowed Filipinos among the lowland Christian majority that would come to dominate the nation-making process to enter into the politics, significance, and history of this otherwise abstracted awit. Indeed, religion is a lacuna in Anderson's theorization of how national consciousness forms. Though buried and incipient, there was enough fodder for the nation latent in the epic poem of For Florante et Laura to withstand the changes of literary fashion. Macior, the pseudonym of an author writing in a 1901 issue of Diario de Filipinas, wrote that Florante is always read with vivid interest by Tagalogs because it voices every suffering, every misery of an unfortunate land. On October 1, 1903, the newspaper Katwiran hailed the poem's moral, political, and social relevance, offering beneficial lessons to Tagalogs of all social, educational, and economic levels. So, from the view of its colonial era reception, the affective intimacies of heterosexual romantic love, particularly its suffering, and its contrast to homosocial bonds, can link the Noli to Florante and open a plane of comparison regarding national political development. The Noli presents the romantic love of its protagonists, Ibarra and Maria Clara, as idealized and fated. The engagement between the two handsome, wealthy, dutiful youths was arranged by the families, the naturalized carriers of tradition and values, and the naturalized recipients of duty and fidelity in both Southeast Asian and Catholic Hispanic cultures. But the engagement was equally chosen and celebrated by the two hearts. Fatedness and a sense of naturalness characterize their love, which is unblemished, romantic, and hopeful. Nourished in the protection of the nunnery, where Maria Clara receives her education, their love is untested and innocent, and there is nothing but promise for the development of their future. This is the official sanctioned narrative of Catholic conversion and colonial development or uplift. It is the more sanguine, naive reading of the colonial promise, a reformist position where the young country of Filipinas looks to Mother Spain for greater rights and voice within the empire. However, the naivete of this promise, this love, is hinted at when, upon his return, after every noise in the street, quote, caused the maiden to tremble and quicken the beatings of her heart, Maria Clara wished that she were back in the quiet convent, where she could have seen him again without emotion and agitation, with calm, end quote. Their love is a higher Platonic ideal, pure, reciprocal, and whole. When Ibarra and Maria Clara reunite, quote, what said these two souls, communicating through the language of the eyes, more perfect than that of the lips, the language given to the soul, in order that sound may not mar the ecstasy of feeling, end quote. This pure idealized love cannot traffic in the realities of the world it's meant to inhabit. Later, the vision of Ibarra's love stays temporary madness and the seeking of vengeance that would have only resulted in short-sighted violence. Next slide. Oh, sorry, next slide again. He raised his hand, but with the swiftness of light, a girlish form put itself between them and delicate fingers restrained the avenging arm. It was Maria Clara. Ibarra stared at her with a look that seemed to reflect madness. Slowly, his clenched fingers relaxed, letting fall the body of the Franciscan and the knife. Covering his face, he fled through the crowd. The young, emergent Patria Filipinas is personified by the Spanish Filipina mestiza Maria Clara herself. She is the inheritance of both races. While studying in Europe, the memory of Maria Clara is no less than the memory of Ibarra's homeland. Next slide. It seemed to me that you were the fairy, the spirit, the poetic incarnation of my fatherland. Beautiful, unaffected, lovable, frank, a true daughter of the Philippines. That beautiful land which unites with the imposing virtues of the mother country Spain, the admirable qualities of a young people. As you unite in your being all that is beautiful and lovely, the inheritance of both races. So indeed the love of you and that of my fatherland have become fused into one, end quote. Keeping true to his love for her, even while separated, is no less than a strengthening of his love of country and the formation of a nationalist orientation. This nationalist orientation guides him through all foreign experiences only deeper back into his own homeland, rather than toward acquiring new geographies of political affinity or new homes for one's affections and ambitions. Next slide. Could I forget you? When in Germany, as I wandered at twilight in the woods, peopled with the fantastic creations of its poets and the mysterious legends of past generations, always I called upon your name. The beautiful skies of Italy with their clear depths reminded me of your eyes. Its sunny landscape spoke to me of your smile. The plains of Andalusia with their scent-laden airs, peopled with oriental memories full of romance and color. But as literary critic Caroline S. Howe notes, in the fishing expedition, she is enjoined to sing a song now known as Maria Clara's song that connects life and death, quote, in one's own country, with the abiding presence and absence of the nurturing mother and lover. Not only the Patria Filipinas, Maria Clara embeds in the young Patria the love of the colonial mother Spain, and through it, the love of Christianity's Holy Father. Further, Howe reminds that for all her passivity, the female love object, Maria Clara, is nevertheless the fulcrum that advances the plot. Key characters are brought into dynamic relationship with each other through her. Because of her and through her, the drama of the Noli and the fates of the numbers of its characters unfold. Seen in this way, the Noli resembles Florante in that both employ traditional heteronormative romantic love as a phenomenal and symbolic vehicle to express love of country during a time of political censorship of anti-colonial sentiment. Next slide. So heteronormative love accordingly becomes the crucible for the expression, dissemination, and memorialization of love of country. Perpetually reproducible and potentially fertile due to heteronormative symbolism, the Noli owes its currency to this heteronormative love. At one level, the novel retains its appeal because of its message of love. At another, the Noli endures as a founding text because it propagates love of country, securing national belonging as a potent social affect. However, scholars have questioned the heteronormative familial model for the nation represented in the Noli. This is important because, in another sense, Noli's narrative also propounds that a man must remain single for a truly national love to emerge. These homosocial male bonds in the Noli are in fact what distinguish it from Florante, and they are the vehicle by which the nationalizing of a man's subjectivity and political consciousness emerges. This is what allows for the Noli's affective patriotism to progress politically from Florante's mere cries of injustice. Next slide. Homosocial affect and homosocial bonds are necessarily abstractable. No particular male is individualized, as would necessarily be the case for a romantic love object. To do otherwise would endanger the heteronormative foundation of the nation state. National patriotic love is, on the one hand, imagined and duplicable diachronically, yet on the other, intimate and exclusive. The imagined community of the nation extends off the pages and across time to include the readers of the Noli, but is marked by an intimacy that binds this specific community. The homosocial bonds that do not elevate Ibarra and Elias specifically, but rather their friendship or mentor-mentee relationship generally. This framing revises the understanding of literature's affective national symbolism in line with the arguments of Renee Hudson and Caroline Howe. Doris Sommer's foundational fictions influentially highlighted heterosexual romance as the paradigm for the nation in 19th century literature in Latin America. The paradigm, indeed, that allows Florante et Laura to be read in a patriotic key. Next slide. But it was what Hudson called Rizal's guerrilla conversion narrative that truly introduced the tradition of the nation in Philippine literature. Next slide. A literary development from Florante et Laura to the Noli that also tracks the parallel development of the Creole Hijos del País rebellion into the National Philippine Revolution. Hudson describes the guerrilla conversion as a homosocial mentorship in which a young reformist man pursues a more moderate path for political freedoms and social regeneration until a pivotal traumatic event opens the mentee to his male mentor's revolutionary tutelage. The decolonial mode of relation occurs through homosocial friendship, which then forms the foundations for Philippine nationalism. Like Benedict Anderson's theorized imagined community, which is also present in Rizal, the guerrilla conversion narrative is similarly based on deep horizontal comradeship, rather than biological familial connections. However, the guerrilla conversion narrative also offers an explicit critique of the heterosexual romance by constructing a national imaginary based on homosociality and demonstrating the limits of romance for national allegory, Hudson argues. Next slide. Yet Hudson contends that it's not until an explicitly queer framework of the love triangle, which reintroduces women and heterosocial revolutionary potential, that the nationalist novel tradition fully resists nuclear atomistic couples, which then close in on itself instead of extending outward for participation of all potential nationalists, citizens, or patriots. Within this queer love triangle could be included Rizal's implicitly queer homosocial bond, as well as Balthazar and others' traditional heteronormative nuclear family, which reproduces itself genetically over time rather than closing in merely between two in love, as the emblematic national romantic form. Indeed, the national familial paradigm has long framed Philippine national politics, from the revolutionary Katipunan, the homosocial fraternity that started that revolution, invoking Inang Bayan, mother country, to post-colonial Ferdinand Marcos's conjugal dictatorship. Remaining a bachelor for the nation, however, is not a utopic, egalitarian, homosocial experience in the Noli. Howe highlighted the fraught process by which the blood debt and vengeance rooted in the Ibarra family's historical wrongs against Eliases are transmuted into the latter's patriotic self-sacrifice and the former's turn to revolution. These nationalizing acts are coded as both male and homosocial because to be a true patriot, one must be selfless, masculine, and disciplined enough to sacrifice one's own personal comforts and happiness for the higher claims of the nation. The insularity and domesticity of the nuclear family resists a truly national orientation. Further, it is decidedly male sacrifice that is coded as national and patriotic, as Maria Clara's own suffering and sacrifice only result in her isolation from society in the convent, a deepening of her female orientation toward the private, the personal, and the domestic, decidedly non-national planes. It's worth noting, however, that while a good marriage and happy family are denied Ibarra by force of circumstance, Elias renounces them by choice, as Carl Howe reminds us. In this way, Rizal can perhaps be seen to underscore a class difference in terms of nationalist priming. Those who have long suffered the injustices of poverty and colonialism can more readily access the kind of collective affect, usually of threat or suffering, that can form the cross-class, multi-ethnic bonds of nation, the stuff of shared political purpose and its goals. They have nothing to lose, unlike the privileged who tread conservatively through slow reform until personal trauma unmasks for them the true colonial condition and the national's potential and urgency. The aristocratic, romantic suffering of Florante, meanwhile, cannot rise to this level of organization and political scaffolding. Rather, it serves as an allegory of pain and yearning only, a critique of injustice through comparative phenomenality, without a view to the development of its politics. If at the end the lovers are reunited, the kingdoms are restored, and the moral friend converts to Christianity, thereby joining one's ecumene and geography of political affinity, it is a happy ending that provides succor to one's reformist hopes, or a sufficiently abstracted vehicle by which to safely cry aloud, or to see your suffering resonated in the world. But it does not yet imagine a community born of such shared phenomenality, nor enable the political implications of one.
I'll talk about the colonial origins of the founding fiction, which is the Noli. The Noli's beginnings can be traced back to the arrival of Spanish colonialism on the island of Homonhon in 1521, where the Portuguese explorer Ferdinand Magellan converted a number of natives to Catholicism and later met his death at the hands of the chieftain Lapu-Lapu. The Spanish survivor, Juan Sebastián Elcano's succeeding circumnavigation of the world, inaugurated 375 years under the colonial yoke. This ended in 1896 with the outbreak of the Philippine Revolution, leading to the establishment of the First Republic in Asia. This history determined that the novel could not have been written in any language other than Spanish. Published in 1887, Noli Me Tangere became the first Asian novel to expose colonial abuses from the perspective of the subjugated natives to the wider world. The novel came out in the same year as Émile Zola's La Terre, Anton Chekhov's Ivanov, August Strindberg's The Father, Mikhail Bakunin's God and the State, Frederick Engels' The Condition of the Working Class in England in 1844, and Friedrich Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morality. As Harold Augenbraum observes, the Noli, along with Rizal's later novel El Filibusterismo, became one of the earliest artistic expressions of the Asian colonial experience. The beginnings of the novel's anti-colonial consciousness date back, however, to 1872, with the Cavite Mutiny, a short-lived uprising of 200 or so native soldiers and Navy personnel, supported by liberal reformers, including the three Filipino priests, Jose Burgos, Mariano Gomez, and Jacinto Zamora, who were charged with treason and sedition. The brutal public execution of the clerics galvanized anti-colonial consciousness and a sense of Filipino identity, including Rizal's. Began in 1884, while Rizal was studying medicine in Madrid, the Noli was continued in Paris and completed 3 years later in Berlin, where it was published by a small press. While the Noli was finding its way into the world, bells were tolling for Multatuli, also known as Edward Does Dekker, whose fiction exposed the sins of Dutch colonial rule in the East Indies, and Emma Lazarus, who penned the poem immortalizing the Statue of Liberty. Indeed, before 1887, global events had helped frame Rizal's century, given the breathtaking scale of colonial expansion and the subsequent emergence of native anti-colonial consciousness, ushering in new visions and politics as critiques of the colonial condition. The historian Nicolas Zafra writes that when Rizal was born in 1861 in Calamba, the known world was grappling with interregnums and social unrest, and Spanish society was very much agitated and disturbed, riven with revolts, civil wars, factional conflicts. Rizal was 7 years when Queen Isabella II was overthrown in 1868 due to progressive disaffections with her rule. In 1869, a new constitution in Spain was created to safeguard liberal ideas, including reform of the colonial administration of the Philippines, which never materialized. Across Europe, liberal values were on the rise, promoting individual liberties, except those of the colonized. The late 18th and 19th centuries, according to Eric Hobsbawm, represented the age of revolution. The French and industrial revolutions that marked the decline of absolutist monarchies on the one hand, and the rise of the modern nation state on the other. The Philippine propaganda movement and the Philippine Revolution, however, were distinctive in bridging the prior age of Atlantic revolutions and anti-colonial revolution in Latin America with anti-colonial, revolutionary, and decolonizing periods to come in the global South over the 20th century. This tumultuous turn of the 20th century period also saw the rise of Japan as a modern world power and gave rise to the Asianists and pan-Islamic critiques that would animate Asian nationalisms to come, including that of the Philippines. Yet the Philippine Revolution would come to play a special role in inspiring Asian nationalisms and anti-colonial revolution across Southeast Asia and East Asia, with Rizal's Noli in particular spurring and shaping the region's anti-colonial nationalist critique. Approaching 140 years since publication, the Noli has paralleled the life of the Filipino nation as it transitioned from colonial to the Cold War periods, and finally to the resurgent times of anti-colonialism. Such periods are heuristic devices with which to understand the Noli's broader significance as a national epic read for specific and mostly contestatory purposes. So as I will discuss later on, there are many interpretations of Rizal, and most of them do not agree with each other, but Rizal is able to contain them all. So how do we explain that? The colonial period pertains to the era of Spanish and American colonialism following the publication of Rizal's novel in 1887. The Cold War covers the first decades after the Second World War, immediately after the Philippines fell under a brief Japanese occupation, and the U.S. brought independence in 1946. Finally, decolonial refers to the period of radical recovery in the wake of the long resurgence of nationalism from the 1960s to the present, wherein Denali serves to sustain the anti-colonial tradition embedded within itself. It must be recalled that the first official colonial response to Denali was censorship. When the novel reached Manila, it excited a few Filipinos who were lucky enough to get hold of it while angering the Spanish friars, including the Dominican Archbishop Pedro Payo, who sent a copy to the rector of the University of Santo Tomas for evaluation. An official report found the novel to be heretical and subversive. Writing in defense of Rizal, the journalist and fellow propaganda movement member Marcelo H. Del Pilar, using his pseudonym Plaridel, examined the sentence laid down by this judge and enemy of the Filipino novelists. The dictatorship of the friars, Del Pilar bristled, could not countenance Rizal's novel and would rather and quote, wish to change the title Noli Me Tangere, touch me not, to Noli Me Legere, read me not. Clericalism, he wrote, should be grasped as a universal problem and therefore has no mother country. By openly attacking the friars and invoking the Enlightenment and secularization, Del Pilar was appealing to the liberal elements of the colonial regime. Most importantly, however, he defended Rizal against Font's accusations of separatism. The novel, he said, is far from being separatist, and the censor's judgment is clearly inaccurate and slanderous. Protected by his whiteness and Austrian citizenship, Ferdinand Blumentritt did not mince words. The novel was anti-Spanish. For if Rizal's novel is truly as anti-Spanish as his enemies paint it, he argued in 1889, not without irony, then whoever impugns it should be rewarded. That's his word. The purpose of the author, he wrote, was to give plastic form to the abuses of the administration, to the helplessness of the political prisoners who were accused with or without cause, to the inhuman cruelty engendered by ambitious friars. These figures, he concluded, appear not in vague personifications, and this is the argument that is being made by Nicole. What makes the novel important politically is the fact that it's able to represent the grievances in realistic terms, not in the form of romance, as can be found, for instance, in Florante et Laura. For Blumentritt, however, Rizal's critique of colonial regime was not the problem. In France, he argued Émile Zola was being lionized for depicting his country as a brothel, a paradise of despicable rogues. Liberalism was then sweeping Europe in the latter part of the 19th century. To critique was to be ahead of the times, and Rizal was doing that. But Rizal was born an Indio in a Spanish colony, so his sin was that he was born an Indio. That is, his presumed racial inferiority added insult to the injury his novel had caused among the peninsulares, especially friars and civil servants. And yet, Blumentritt argued the novel might have represented the apex of the Spanish colonial project, proof of its civilizing mission, wherein an Indio had come to master Western reason itself. But the friars would not accept that. After the United States defeated Spain in the Spanish-American War and had paid $20 million to acquire the Philippine Islands in 1898, the Americans used Rizal's so-called perfected morality and civilization to justify its new colonial adventure in the Pacific. In this new colonial context, Rizal was viewed as a democratic emblem fit for what was then U.S. President William McKinley called the benevolent assimilation of the Philippines. The U.S. framed Rizal's critique of the Spanish Empire as a precondition for American occupation of the Philippines. Seen this way, Rizal hailed or interpolated American colonialism long before the islands became its new possessions. American historian Austin Craig was thus able to acclaim Rizal as America's forerunner because of his unceasing efforts for a wiser, better governed, and more prosperous Philippines, and because of his frank admission that he hoped thus in time there might come a freer Philippines. Rizal, Craig said, was called traitor to Spain and ingrate. Now, honest, open criticism is not treason. So this was during the American colonial period in the Philippines, and there was resistance to the Americans. But in Craig's version, there was a totally different narrative. Our present Philippine government, he wrote in 1913, when the islands were directly under American control, guarantees to its citizens as fundamental rights that no person shall be held to answer for a capital crime unless on an indictment, nor may he be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process or law. The sedition law was in force at this point. Craig understood that the U.S. colonial presence in the Philippines was meant to produce and reproduce Rizal long after his execution by the Spanish colonial authorities. At the time when America came to the islands, there was among them no Rizal, and that was the justification for the Americans. The Americans wanted to create many Rizals among the natives, with a knowledge of history that would enable him to recognize that they were getting what they had been wanting. Without Rizal, America found its reason for being in the Philippines, to make of every Filipino in its care a future likeness of Rizal. The American colonial period accordingly became invested in Rizal's reproduction. In 1900, 2 years after the annexation of the Philippines, the civil government of Negros had declared Rizal's birthday as a holiday under the aegis of the American military on the island. There was martial law, in fact. In 1931, 19 June was marked for annual commemoration in all schools, including private ones, through proclamation number 377. In 1957, and this is the law that explains why you're still studying Rizal up until now, a decade after the nominal grant of Philippine independence by the U.S., the post-colonial Filipino nation state mandated the study of Rizal's life and work, particularly the Noli. Passage of Republic Act number 1425, also known as the Rizal Law, coincided with the height of the Cold War. In the Cold War Philippines, Rizal exemplified the quiet success of the American neocolonial project, providing continuity between colonialism's old and new, and at the same time setting the stage for the resurgence of the anti-colonial tradition began in 1896 and revived in the 1960s with the groundswell of decolonizing initiatives. On the Ateneo campus, that took place in 1968 when Dawn from the Hill was published, and the publication of that particular manifesto led to the Filipinization of the university. In the Philippines, the Cold War and decolonization overlapped in the aftermath of 1946, producing strange confluences. In particular, U.S. interventions were disguised as decolonizing programs within the new Filipino post-colony. A salient example was the establishment of the Philippine chapter of PEN International. The fiction writer Efchenel Jose instigated its founding after visiting the U.S. on a Smith-Mundt leadership grant in 1955. 10 years later, he started a bookshop. You can still go to that bookshop in Ermita, funded by an annual grant of $10,000 from the U.S. government. Francis Stoner Saunders revealed in 1999 that the CIA had infiltrated PEN International, and it appears that Jose was a key operative for embedding U.S. foreign policy in the post-colony. Rizal featured in the scheme. The Philippine chapter of PEN International inaugurated a plenary lecture named after him for its annual conference. The organization championed Filipino themes while advancing, wittingly or not, covert U.S. interests. Consider the educator Encarnacion Alzona's 1961 lecture. Alzona acknowledged the material assistance from the US and echoed its Cold War policy. In 1950, she wrote in her Rizal lecture, just 4 years after independence, the country sent Filipino troops to Korea. So now there are two Koreas, being among the first member states of the United Nations to respond to the call for aid to resist communist aggression. Alzona also lauded the triumph of English over Spanish in the new post-colony, thus reinforcing American exceptionalism. The US war was far more acceptable and therefore more successful colonizer. The US was far more acceptable and therefore more successful colonizer than its predecessor. Encouraged by the global tide of decolonization that formally began in the Philippines in 1946, progressive Filipino intellectuals of the 1960s and 1970s revisited Rizal and read him against the grain, pushing back against more than half a century of colonial containment that had started in 1898 and had peaked in the 1950s with the Cold War. So the American sponsorship of Rizal, for instance, as a national hero, spoke to that project. The radical recovery of Rizal, and this radical recovery took place in the 1960s, and it's a recovery that is ongoing up until today. The radical recovery of Rizal took off in the mid-1960s when the young revolutionary and former English teacher, Jose Maria Sison, so it's curious, he was an English teacher, and at the same time, he eventually became a revolutionary. But Jose Maria Sison reconstructed the radical tradition in Filipino thought, connecting the anti-colonial past to the new colonial present. Sison suggested creating the second propaganda movement, whose inspiration was the 19th century crusade, of which Rizal formed part. So there was the first propaganda movement and the second propaganda movement. Sison revived the spirit of the Philippine Revolution of 1896 as an unfinished project. He sought expressly to decolonize Rizal, becoming the first thinker to situate the novelist in the context of the national democratic struggle in the Philippines, a struggle that continues to this day. For Sison, Rizal was necessary for grasping not only the contradictions of old and new imperialisms, but also the paths to their undoing. Sison understood Rizal as both reformists and radical, a holistic line of thought that eschewed the dichotomy then dominant among post-war Filipino thinkers that would pit Rizal against the Tagalog revolutionary Andres Bonifacio. And that kind of contest was represented by scholars at UP who wanted to see Rizal as radical, and scholars at the Ateneo who offered a more conservative reading of Rizal. But in Sison, he tried to unite both tendencies. What made Rizal a progressive and a radical of his time, Sison said, was his ultimate recognition that the liberties of the individual could be realized only if the nation as a whole, particularly the masses whom he spontaneously observed, would be uplifted. So in the novel, as Nicole was suggesting earlier, the everyday lives of the colonized were depicted in close detail in the novel. And so the masses, the people, they were represented in the novel, but as scholars like Benedict Anderson and Ha would suggest, they became accessible via gossip. So they were not present, and so they were spectral in that sense. Abroad, this radicalizing trend was spreading to the global due to the global imperative to decolonize in various forms. In 1971, American biographer Bernard Rains considered Rizal to be the intellectual ancestor of Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., labeling him as one of the first modern political martyrs, just as the civil rights movement was sweeping across the U.S. In 1977, the Malaysian intellectual Alatas reworked Rizal's ideas to counter the colonial myth of the lazy Southeast Asian native. More recently, American sociologist Julian Go has explored the transnational connections made by Rizal and others to advance ilustrado transnationalism, a phrase that belongs to Go, wherein native elites in the Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico collaborated as they represented their interests before Spanish and American colonial regimes. John Nery, for his part, has documented the many and varied historical recuperations of Rizal across Southeast Asia. With the survey of Rizalian criticism, what the survey of Rizalian criticism shows is how discrepant political positions and historical temporalities, from colonial to decolonial and everything in between, are able to converge in Rizal. During the colonial periods, interpretations focus on the subversive quality of the novel, as well as on the race of its author, whose claims for reform and revolutionary aspirations were limited by his subaltern position. In American hands, Rizal's martyrdom legitimized U.S. annexation of the islands and reinforced a narrative of American exceptionalism. As a result, the spirit of the Philippine Revolution that shaped Rizal's novel was glossed over until the Cold War, and native intellectuals interpreted Rizal in ways that advanced U.S. neocolonial interests. Rizal's revolutionary potential was suppressed to highlight the benefits of the American colonial project as a democratizing enterprise whose vaunted benefits extended into the post-independence years. By the 1960s, however, with the resurgence of Filipino nationalism, radical third worldism, and the urgencies of decolonization, political Rizal was being resurrected. Every historical period thus created its own version of the author and his work. Each generation, Leon Maria Guerrero concluded, an Atenean, will have its own verdict on the Noli, and in the end, as E. San Juan says, you get the Rizal you deserve. For Carolyn Howe, the ambiguity and undecidability that inform relationships between Rizal, the Noli, and the reader itself defines the body of Rizal reading, revealing a plurality of competing interpretations of a single text. Most importantly, the competing interpretations track or reveal the key historical debates that characterize the evolution of the Filipino nation as a post-colonial form. So if you want to understand the political biography of the Filipino nation, read the criticisms that respond to Rizal. And you can see the development of the nation as a political form. The success of the Noli, as Blumentritt says, lies precisely in its capacity to provide plastic form for historical experience, in stark contrast to the inchoateness of Florante. This success owes as much to Rizal. It is his achievement as it does to the history of the novel as a literary form. By drawing on the conventions of the novel, Rizal provided a portrait of a discernible time and place. Such conventions were specific to the Western emergence of the historical novel in the 19th century, which saw the genre, as George Lukács puts it, exemplify man's maturity, the age of triumphing prose. For Lukács, the hero of the epic finds himself at the summit of events, signifying a magnificent type. So, over the top, larger than life kind of character. That's for the epic. But for the novel, something realistic, something people could recognize themselves as readers. For Lukács, the hero of the epic finds himself at the summit of events, signifying a magnificent type. The principal figures of the novel, in comparison, are typical characters nationally. So you have Sisa, among others, the people of San Diego, and so on and so forth. But in that sense of the decent and average, rather than the eminent and all-embracing. In Denali, Rizal sought to render the colonial condition faithfully, as he declared in the novel's dedication. In so doing, he aligned himself with the tradition of the Western historical novel, from Walter Scott to Leo Tolstoy, which foregrounded fidelity to reality. So the other thing that emerged was realism itself as a convention. By applying historical fidelity to description of the colonial moment, he altered the form of the historical novel by relating it to the subaltern condition of his time. Equally important, he demonstrated the incendiary potential of this altered form, its power as anti-colonial critique. And this is a critique that we need to revive and continue to explore. That is, he showed how the typical national character to emerge might be a native subversive. Intellectual historian Rasil Mohares suggests that Rizal was largely responsible for importing the novel form to the Philippines fully grown, so Athena-like. And this is like a recurring kind of criticism. You can see this in Bernard, for instance, the idea of the form emerging Athena-like, fully mature, as it were. Yet he qualifies this by saying that the novel has to acquire a local habitation for it to assume the kind of existence it had. Mohares provides more hypotheses for theorizing the form, but stops short of specifying how its anti-colonial content makes the Filipino historical novel unique. He refers to colonialism as the main source of its social content, for instance, but never quite articulates the far-reaching implications of the Western form being made to accommodate anti-colonial elements. So that's the distinction that we can find in Rizal. He was using a Western form, but he imbued it with anti-colonial aspirations. The historical rise of the novel as a genre did indeed coincide with the political emergence of the colonized, who spoke truth to power through plots, characters, and conflicts, foregrounding the perspective of the subjugated, giving form to nationalist longings from below, and anticipating the groundswell of decolonization that would follow. This, then, is a radical difference of the novel in the hands of Rizal, a difference that constitutes the originality, the newness of the anti-colonial novel as a form. In particular, this newness, and this is the argument that Nicole and I are making, was rooted in the utopia that the anti-colonial novel was conjuring. A new world where the rights and dignity of the colonized would be enshrined, where the master-slave relations of the old colonial system would be abolished, where the freedom of the subjugated would create freer political ties and more radical commitments. We are far from that condition. What enabled this newness, beginning as a mere thought in the novel, was critique of the colonial system, a critique encouraging the emergence of decolonization as a world historical force that would transform and continue to transform political and cultural relations at all levels. But the main paradox remains, which represents the dual drive of the Noli: to reproduce the affect of the nation through heterosexual affordances, and at the same time to interrupt this reproductive process by foregrounding the irreproducibility of the single man whose bachelorhood threatens the future of the national family. This paradox is related to the peculiarities of the anti-colonial novel, which expresses the global spread and continuity of the Western form on the one hand, and the radical difference that anti-colonial content poses to the form on the other. The Noli view thus signifies the reproducibility of the Western novel, as well as the irreproducibility of the colonial mode in the anti-colonial setting. So pronouncing that word is difficult, and that shows us the difficulty of the task, the impossibility of the task. But we need to articulate it. We need to describe it. A Western form is deployed to counter the hegemony of the colonial system that enables the genre in the first place. Similarly, the Noli reproduces the affect of the nation while also interrupting the logic of its related reproductive process, foregrounding instead the promise of bachelorhood for the making or queer remaking of the post-colonial nation. What is found here is a process wherein colonial form and anti-colonial content clash and harmonize to produce a post-colonial alternative, a kind of anti-colonial dialectic, if you will. By interrupting the reproductive process, the Noli allows for the possibility of the new that captures the radical spirit of anti-colonialism in toto. Read this way, Rizal's fiction remains expansive, and its political readings as yet unexhausted. And this room is filled with young students. Your readings will enrich our understanding of Rizal and our understanding of our nation. It can or will remain relevant for as long as the task of decolonization too remains unfinished, to make of the nation a Filipino post-colony.
Thank you very much for your thought-provoking, fantastic presentations, Dr. CuUnjieng, Aboitiz, and Dr. Veric. We now proceed to the open forum of the lecture.
Hello po, I'm Edward Florida from 4AB Literature English LCS, and this question is directed to Doc Nicole. I would like to ask po, because I was actually very invested in your talk with relating yung mga courtly love, romance in both Noli Me Tangere and Florante at Laura, and alongside also the queer love framework by the end. And I would like to ask, like given how like you related the importance of courtly love during those times in relation to yung mga political identity and revolution happening during that time with the Spanish colonialism, I would like to ask if is there something that you want writers today to input when inputting romance in the Philippine society?
Do I need this or? Oh. I think it's not prescriptive in any way. I'm just opening a plane of comparison between the two, because they come from different historical contexts, politically as well as in terms of the development of literary forms, primarily in Spain, and then later to the West, and as they were transplanted onto our islands. And so it's just a way of opening that comparison rather than a prescriptive sort of suggestion that I have to writers. So looking at the ways in which the metaphor of love was used and handled and reinterpreted, and the limits of certain kinds, and what it says about our forms of political imagining.
Thank you so much, Doc.
So thank you for organizing this series, first of all. This question is for Dr. Veric, but if Nicole wants to answer, yes, please. You mentioned that Noli couldn't have been written in any other language than Spanish. As readers, what then do we lose, if anything, or what should we be conscious of when reading it in English or Filipino? And second question, of the numerous English translations, which one do you prefer and why? And are there any English translations that you would like to see back in wider circulation?
That's a tough question it's a tough question to answer. But I will try. Rizal had considered writing the novel in another European language, but he decided to write it in Spanish because he was trying to address the Spanish colonial regime, and he did not see himself, as Del Pilar was trying to demonstrate, as separate from Spain. So language is important, and what's interesting for me is that for many of us in the Philippines, we're not familiar with Rizal in Spanish. We read Rizal either in English or in Filipino. I have yet to hear of there might be translations into other languages. And I think that's a worthwhile project to undertake. But it represents, I think, a contradiction that Rizal tried to imagine the nation in Spanish, and yet when we read him today, we have no access at all to that language. But I see that not as a limitation, but rather as a kind of freedom. Because in my case, for instance, when I grew up, I read Rizal in Filipino. So I attended a Catholic high school in Aklan, and all I remember from reading Rizal was the play that we needed to stage. And so the groups were assigned a chapter, and that's all we did. I never read Rizal in English, and for the longest time I tried to resist reading Rizal because Rizal is so foundational. Every scholar who wants to legitimize themselves, will have to write about Rizal. So it's a kind of ritual that for you to declare your independence as an intellectual in the Philippines, you need to write about Rizal. I did not want to read Rizal until Nicole invited me to go write a chapter with her. And I was forced to go back to the novel, and I made it a point to read the translation by Virgilio Almario. In terms of English translation that may be recommended, you can turn to Benedict Anderson for advice. For instance, he says that when he was writing his essay, he was saying that the translations that existed did not capture the acid quality of Rizal's language and thinking, and also the humor. And so there's a recent translation of Leon Maria Guerrero's. There's a new translation into Filipino by Danton Remoto, I think. So to make a recommendation is beyond what I can do. But what I can tell you is that working on this particular chapter, Nicole and I were forced to see how Rizal was interpreted across time. And I think that's a contribution that the article is trying to make, to provide an exhaustive survey of the interpretations of Rizal from its publication all the way to the present.
For translations, I'm trying to remember. The one that I tend to like was the very first English translation, and I'm forgetting now the name of the translator into English. Charles something. That's the one I usually. Yeah. That's the one that I like, because despite all the different drawbacks, I find it has the least amount of sort of baggage in terms of theorizing that comes later with certain kinds of teleologies or sort of anachronistic, I think, interpretations or additions. So in terms of just the language, even though it doesn't always perform faithfully in terms of the formal translation, I find that in terms of the political content, it's the most neutered in a certain way because it's closer. Yeah.
Okay.
Hi. I think I'll just sit down. I really find it interesting from the lecture that when you're growing, like as someone who's recently graduated, when you grow up reading or learning about Rizal, let's say in elementary or in high school, you don't really know the context in which Rizal was being taught. So when you get that background of, oh, there's the American neo-colonial project that paints Rizal in a very different picture, and you have Season and the people from the second propaganda movement painting him in this other light, and you have scholars all throughout the years adding to that discussion. I think I think it was only in college also when I started realizing that Rizal isn't just this one person with very distinct or one-sided views about how the country should be. So, because I think when we were growing up, we differentiated, or parang dichotomy sila with Bonifacio. So, I guess my question would be, how do you trickle that down from where we started learning about it in college and like here in lectures like this to the elementary grade? Because we know that how our curriculums are shaped also is quite political in itself. And how do we want that version of Rizal depicted to children and growing up, na rin when they become citizens of their own in the country? Yeah.
So how do we keep the conversation about Rizal going? That's essentially your question, Mika. I have two words as answers to that question, and they are law and translation. We need the support of the state, and the state has to create a policy, and that's what we've seen in Rizal. That after the 1950s, you couldn't graduate from college without reading Rizal, or at least discussing him. And so the state policy is crucial to the conversation. And we need to create more laws. Like, for instance, there should be a law decreeing that we should read our other writers, not only Rizal, but other writers in different linguistic traditions. So writers in English, writers in Filipino, so that we can continue the conversation. The other side of the conversation can be the act of translation itself. And for instance, in the Philippines, we can imagine it will be great to translate Rizal into our major languages. So we have more than 100 languages in the Philippines, but how many translations into Filipino languages do we have? So a law can generate the conversation, and translation can reinforce that conversation.
I'd also say that one sort of analogous way that we could try and foreground changing historical context in which interpretation is happening in a simpler way, cascading it down, is to highlight Rizal's own changing interpretations of political events and his own sort of ambiguities and development within his thinking, which changes over time. There's a way in which he can be presented as this finished product, when actually, if you look at his writings and his thinking, there's a lot of change and reversals and hesitation and sort of hazarding certain attempts and then backtracking. And so if you foreground that kind of ambiguity, it should also draw a parallel kind of to the interpretive context in which he's used and how that would necessarily change over time, just the way that he would. So I think that might be one way to imbue it from the start.
Okay. Let me just reiterate that we also welcome comments and questions from our participants in Zoom. You can type your question in a chat box, or you can use the raise hand function so that I can acknowledge you. Okay, we have another question.
Hi, I'm Zed from UP Diliman. And my question is based from the context of the growing academic criticism against nationalism, where nationalism is criticized as just an extension of Imperial Manila. So you get academics like Jojo Abinales who criticize nationalism and all that as just an extension of elitism and an extension of the revolution from the center. So it's just not just about the conflict between how to interpret nationalism, but you have another growing camp, which is multipolarity, that we must reject nationalism because it attacks different identities of the Filipino, and which makes sense because if you go south in the Philippines, not all of them identify as Filipinos, especially the Moro. But another so by keeping that in mind, what's also confusing is that Rizal is a universalist thinker. So liberal rights, human rights, the discussion of justice is also universal. And then at the same time, you have a growing group of academics who criticize that as being Eurocentric. So my question is, what is the position of Rizal in this growing academic contention, which is especially in the placement of Philippine studies? Thank you.
Unfortunately, Rizal is dead, so you can't participate in the conversation. But yeah, Nicole.
I would say that I don't think that in any way we are advocating for ideologies. We're looking at the artifact of these literary products and the way that they've been circulated and used and interpreted within a national frame. And also their role within the actual theorizing of nationalism, with which they are historically connected, rather than seeing it as a project for what one should politically aspire to or not. I have no investment in that. And I think that the scholars who write about the literature are also looking at the formal qualities and their sort of imbrication with political context. So I would see it more in that light. And I think that what gives the Noli this kind of plastic form is the way in which it's been forced to speak for different historical contexts. And the law that we have that allows it to be continually reinvested with contemporary meaning. And that gives it a special pride of place, for which reason we continually return to it, this question of the national, because of the way it's implicated in the national. That doesn't occur with other literary products that we have. But it also allows us to all continue to talk to one another through one document, essentially. And in some ways, that's why sort of like biblical references litter so much of literary production, because it's one literary product that is continually interpreted and reinvested with meaning. So it gives you a language. And in the Philippines, this is one of the only things that we have, because so many of our books fall out of print. And this is one that is forced to remain alive. And so then we can reinvest contemporary meaning into it. And then we can talk to one another through it if we choose to. So I think that's how I would respond to that.
I think I'll take a different approach. And for me, I'm deeply invested in the question of Filipino nationalism. And as a graduate student, for instance, in American studies, the most dominant thing that was going on at that point was transnationalism. So everyone was into transnational feminism, transnational American studies, everything transnational. And it meant, at least in my eyes, the denigration of nationalism. So as a Filipino student in an American graduate school, fully aware that the process of nationalism for us up until that point was ongoing, I rejected also the idea that nationalism was not useful. So I think we need to continue to think about nationalism, and the debate is part of it. The critique is part of it. And so instead of the critique denigrating nationalism, I think what the critique does is to sustain nationalism, to find ways of making nationalism much more representative. And speaking of representation, when we were setting up the room, I made sure that we would have the South represented. So on the table here, you can find a design, and it's actually the work of a Bangsamoro designer. So it's here, like on the side, you can see the signature, as it were. And that's our way of bringing other voices into the conversation. So yes, I think we need to continue discussing nationalism, and we can discuss it coldly, or we can discuss it hotly. So we can be partisan about it or non-partisan about it. The point is that we continue the conversation.
Dr. Veric, you mentioned Dawes Decker in the start of your talk. Perhaps compared to Rizal, was Dawes Decker and perhaps Dr. CuUnjieng Aboitiz could also add, was Dawes Decker or other Southeast Asian authors during Rizal's time treated or interpreted similarly or differently, especially in their novels' roles in decolonization?
I will defer to Nicole because her training is in international relations with special focus on Southeast Asia. So between us, my training was in American studies.
Yeah. So Dawes Decker is a comparison that's made. So I don't study literature actually, so I'm not well placed to answer this. I think what I can say though is that Rizal is actually one of the only figures I know of who is hailed across different Southeast Asian political and cultural contexts, which is why you have people in Indonesia and Malaysia called Rizal, Reezal is a common first name. And you have Sukarno referencing Rizal as a hero. It crosses, and then you also even actually, the Chinese Republicans talk about the Philippine Revolution and talk about Rizal. Of course, it's discussed in Japan, but across Southeast Asia, you have others looking to the example of Rizal and more specifically the Philippine Revolution because it occurred so early within an Asian context. It occurred late within the Latin American Atlantic context, but it bridges between those two sort of ages of revolution, that early Atlantic and Latin American age of revolutions, and then the 20th century Asian and global South age of revolution. So it's a bridge between the two. But I would say that Rizal actually holds a very special place and the Philippine Revolution within that, if you look across Southeast Asia. Also in the same way that later on Vietnam gets taken up across Southeast Asia.
Well, maybe just a little bit. In Rizal is the phrase "the demon of comparison," right? And what you're asking about has to do with comparison between two significant writers. But for one to compare, I think the training that's required is, a facility in languages. And so, for instance, if you have to engage in that kind of comparison, you need to learn Dutch, not only Spanish, but in the Philippines, training in different languages is not highly encouraged. And so the lack of facility in a foreign language prevents us from accessing the records. And not only, does that lack of facility prevent us from accessing the records, it also prevents us from engaging with important conversations that were taking place in the past. So it's a handicap that I myself I'm facing. I have, my Spanish is not so good, and so in my own research, my research ends with the American colonial period. Up until the present. And so when I got the invitation from Nicole, I took to it precisely because I saw it as an opportunity to come up with a more coherent narrative for thinking about Philippine history, one that bridges, languages from Spanish to English to Filipino to my native Aklanon, for instance.
Okay. Friends, again, let's give a big hand to Dr. Aboitiz and Dr. Veric We are truly grateful that you are with us in this event. No, and this event again is an output of a very productive partnership between the Literary and Cultural Studies program of the Ateneo and Exploding Galaxies. And to give us the closing remarks for this lecture, we have Dr. CuUnjieng Aboitiz, who is part of Exploding Galaxies, and also to inform you that this is only part of a 3-part series, and please follow us in the Facebook page of the Literary and Cultural Studies program so that you are updated with regard to those other events and the other activities of the program. Dr. Nicole?
Just very briefly, all I want to say is, as the academic advisor and literary advisor to Exploding Galaxies, what we've learned is that it's one thing to republish a novel. So what Exploding Galaxies does is to republish lost classics of Philippine literature. And that's very distinct from reviving a novel. You can republish it, but if nobody rereads it, then it remains just as dead as it ever was. Or if you reread it and you forget about it instantly, it still remains as dead as it ever was. Perhaps more potentially accessible, but not necessarily revived in any way. So our hope in putting together this lecture series with Ateneo, as well as a new journal that we're launching on Saturday called EG, is to widen the world of Philippine letters in which we may discuss our lost classics and our literary tradition, and through which we may reinvest contemporary meaning into our long literary tradition, renewing the connections between past and contemporary, classic and experimental, lost and deleted. And so we thank you so much for being part of that.